I wasn't looking for anything unusual when I stopped in front of those 19th century buildings in Seattle, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. At street level, the windows looked wrong. They weren't display windows, they weren't basement vents. They were full-size windows, stone frames, decorative arches, keystones, except they sat halfway below the sidewalk. Some were sealed, others vanished directly into concrete. I stepped closer. The stonework below the pavement looked older than the brick above it. The proportions felt off. Doorways were compressed. Arches were cut short. It didn't look like a basement. It looked like a street someone erased. That's when the explanation stopped feeling complete. If these were always basements, why design them like storefronts? Why the symmetry? Why the ornamentation? Why invest in detail no one was meant to see? So I looked up historical photographs of the same block. In early images, the entrances were taller. The steps were fewer. The street itself sat lower. I expected minor renovations over time. Instead, I found an entire ground level missing. And Seattle wasn't alone. When I compared images from Chicago, I saw the same pattern. Buildings with what looked like submerged first floors. In parts of London, arch windows dip beneath modern pavement. Individually, each case could be explained. Cities evolve. Streets get repaved. But collectively, the repetition was too clean. Full floors, repeated, across continents. The more I looked, the harder it became to call this random remodeling. And the more it felt like I was standing one level higher than the city was originally built. And that raised a simple question. Why would multiple cities lift their streets and bury their own architecture? I assumed there had to be a straightforward explanation. So I started with Seattle. After the Great Fire of 1889, city officials decided to raise the street level to fix chronic flooding and sewage problems. The old roads were muddy and frequently underwater. Raising them would modernize everything at once. On paper, it made sense. Retaining walls were built along sidewalks. Roads were filled several feet higher. Buildings either added new entrances at the upper level or converted their original ground floors into basements. Functional, practical, logical. Then I looked at the numbers. In some parts of Seattle, the street didn't rise a few inches. It rose nearly 12 feet. 12 feet isn't resurfacing. That's swallowing an entire story. Chicago had its own version decades earlier. In the 1850s and 1860s, entire blocks were lifted, using thousands of jack screws to install a sewer system underneath. Not demolished, lifted. London followed, with massive sewer reconstruction and embankment projects in the mid-1800s. Streets were regraded, riverbanks reinforced. Each city had a documented reason: flooding, sanitation, infrastructure. Individually, the logic holds. But here's where it tightened for me. None of these cities were coordinating with each other. Different governments, different crises. Yet the visual result was nearly identical. Buried arches, submerged windows, doorways cut in half. The explanations were functional. The outcome looked standardized. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the scale of what was buried felt larger than the simplicity of the story explaining it. So I tried to disprove my own suspicion. If streets were raised for sanitation, I expected clean transitions, clear seams, logical modifications. Instead, I found friction. In Seattle, I overlaid original architectural drawings with current street level measurements. In several buildings, what was labelled first floor on early plans now sits partially underground. Not redesigned, not simplified. Complete, with full ceiling heights matching the stories above. That caught me. If officials already knew streets would rise dramatically, why design elaborate stonework at a level about to disappear? Then I measured something more specific. On one block, the elevation change was recorded at just under 12 feet, but neighbouring streets rose closer to 8. That 4-foot variation across short distances creates awkward geometry, and I started seeing it. Corner staircases that don't align cleanly, stone courses interrupted mid-pattern, windows clipped unevenly by pavement. Individually, each could be dismissed as construction compromise, but when inconsistencies repeat block after block, they stop feeling incidental. It didn't look like a clean upward shift. It looked like the definition of ground had been renegotiated mid-city. And that led to a question I hadn't expected to ask. Were the streets raised to meet the buildings? Or were the buildings already standing lower than we assume? To test whether this was coincidence, I compared London more carefully. Near the Thames, I found the same visual tension: arch brickwork cut mid-curve by sidewalks, iron grates where full-height windows once likely opened to daylight. London's sewer crisis in the 1850s is well documented. The Thames became unbearable. Parliament funded massive reconstruction. Completely reasonable. But when I overlaid early maps with modern elevations, what caught me wasn't just that streets were raised, it was how consistently entire lower stories disappeared. Not inches, feet, enough to swallow full rooms. Then I broadened the comparison to other older European districts. Decorative stonework functioning as basement trim. Door arches reduced to half moons beneath pavement. Full symmetry preserved, just lowered. That detail matters. If this were purely improvisational infrastructure work, I would expect more demolition, more asymmetry, more erasure. Instead, cities entombed lower levels intact. Different countries, different engineers, nearly identical visual outcome. That's when the pattern stopped feeling random. It started feeling like a recurring structural reset. Then I stepped back from architecture and looked at administration. Because raising a street is complicated. Raising an entire downtown district is something else. In Chicago, thousands of laborers reportedly turned jack screws in synchronized shifts, lifting multi-story masonry buildings inches at a time while businesses continued operating inside. In Seattle, entire blocks were elevated within tightly clustered time windows, not over generations, but within concentrated bursts following the fire. When I traced permit records and engineering documents, they didn't trickle over decades. They clustered. Districts transformed in compressed spans. That pace surprised me, especially for mid-19th century technology. And here's the friction point that stayed with me. If entire lower floors were being buried, that means utilities, ventilation systems, drainage slopes, and access points originally designed for street level had to be rethought. Rapidly. Not adjusted casually, re-engineered. And yet in many cases those buried floors remained structurally intact. In Seattle, some were later connected into underground walkways, not rubble, not destroyed, reassigned. That scale isn't cosmetic, it's an administrative will reshaping urban topography. And it made me ask a larger question. What kind of pressure, environmental, political, economic, justifies redefining ground level across entire cities within a few decades? At this point, I forced myself to slow down. Flooding was real, sewage was overwhelming, industrial growth was accelerating faster than infrastructure could handle. Chicago's low elevation made gravity-based sewer systems nearly impossible without raising structures. London's stench crisis forced Parliament's hand. Seattle's fire gave officials a rare blank slate. Each city had a crisis. Each had engineering solutions documented in detail. And I could find no evidence of anything extraordinary beyond that. But one tension remained. If sanitation demanded elevation, why preserve the buried facades so carefully? Why not demolish and rebuild at the new height? Industrial cities were not sentimental. Yet instead of erasing the old street level, they sealed it, ornamentation intact. The most practical explanation is economic pragmatism. Masonry buildings were expensive. Lifting or building around them may have been cheaper than total demolition. That explanation might be enough. But when I stand in front of a half-buried arch that was clearly designed for eye level and now sits beneath my feet, it still feels disproportionate. Necessary? Possibly. Proportional? I'm less certain. After weeks of comparing elevations, reading records, and walking these streets myself, I had to admit something. I couldn't find proof of anything hidden. No suppressed catastrophe. No erased disaster. No secret reconstruction event. Just engineering, bureaucracy, crisis response. And yet, when I stand on a modern sidewalk and trace a former doorway beneath it, the experience isn't theoretical, it's physical. I can see the previous street line carved into stone. That layering is visible. What unsettles me isn't conspiracy, it's velocity. Entire districts redefined within decades. Complete floors reassigned from ground to basement. Multiple cities doing it in the same century. Maybe it was simply the growing pains of industrial civilization, cities adapting faster than ever before. Or maybe the 19th century was far more structurally turbulent than we tend to imagine. The more I compare before and after photographs, the more I realize something subtle. We don't just inherit cities, we inherit decisions about what level counts as ground. Once a street is raised, the previous world doesn't disappear. It becomes a layer, and we walk above it without thinking. So the question isn't whether streets were raised, they were. The question is whether we fully grasp the scale of what that meant and what kind of pressure makes a city decide to bury an entire floor instead of starting over. And if you had been a city official in 1890, would you have lifted the ground beneath everyone's feet, or torn the city down and rebuilt it from scratch